to The Marketing Insider, a Claritas podcast for marketers focused on finding and targeting their ideal customers at scale. I'm your host, Monique Ruiz. If you read the title of this episode before hitting play, you might say it's ambitious of us to think we can solve the dilemma of personalization versus privacy in a 30-minute podcast. But while we may not have the silver bullet answer for you, what you can expect from us is a real look at the current privacy laws and what they mean for your business when it comes to customer identity resolution, the non negotiable steps you need to take as a marketer to ensure privacy compliance, how you as an individual consumer can protect yourself online, the best ways to adopt privacy as a focus across the entire organization, and a few dispelling of myths around what privacy compliance is and isn't. For this discussion, I'm welcoming back Claritas CTO Al Gadbut. He was on the podcast nearly a year ago talking about this very topic, but even in just that short amount of time, privacy compliance rules and regulations have changed so much. Later on in the episode, we're going to welcome in Ben Isaacson, Principal of In-House Privacy, who provide on-demand privacy counsel and consulting to help keep companies up to date with the ever-evolving privacy landscape. First up, though, let me welcome back Al Gadbut. Al, thank you for joining me again on the Marketing Insider.
Well, Monique, thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure. And while a lot of folks find this either scary or dry and not not all that interesting, there are a lot of things happening in the privacy space in general, and I'm excited to be able to talk to you about it.
It's definitely an important topic that affects all marketers. So, again, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Before we jump into the laundry list of questions that I do have for you, can you just remind our listeners a little bit about what you do here at Claritas?
Sure. So my official title is CTO. Part of my portfolio responsibilities is privacy and regulation, but also in compliance. But also, I focus on the productization of our ID graph and our email business, and trying to help create that bridge between our consumer segmentation and the online world via email and ID graph.
You're also part of a collaborative work group with other data providers in the industry to kind of help shape some of the changing privacy landscape while simultaneously proactively watching new developments that are coming out on the state and federal level. So, since we talked about a year ago, marketers, they're kept up at night by more than just GDPR, CCPA.
Yeah.
Can you run us through what the new regulations are that are currently in the works and sort of what effects will they have on marketing strategies?
I'll hit it at a high level. And in the end, the way I view this, there's really kind of two pressures within the industry. One, which is technology and device manufacturers. So I mean, we're getting changes within the browsers as well as the devices that people have. And then at the same time, we're getting new legislation coming in from the states. At this point, the federal is kind of stepping back and watching what happens to develop in the states, with the idea that they'll probably end up doing something over the next couple of years. So I'll break down both of those two areas. We've seen browser manufacturers, whether you're talking about Safari or
Hmm.
Google, um, putting out a lot of changes within their browsers as far as what information is available and how you're going to be able to do things within the browsers. So, for example, like setting cookies. And there's even more changes that are happening or proposed that are going to happen in terms of further anonymization. The environment is really focusing on privacy and creating a more private environment for consumers. On the legislative front, you have there's probably been two major laws that have passed. One was CPRA in California, which was essentially CCPA 2.0.
Hmm.
The idea was that CCPA didn't go far enough, and under CPRA, it creates a new class of sensitive personal information. And those include the things that you would normally just think of course, like medical information, phone numbers, credit cards, and then on the demographic level, things like age,
Hmm.
ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. All of this now becomes under a protected class of sensitive personal information. And there's a whole series of steps that people are going to have to take to ensure that people have access to understand what information you're collecting, as well as giving people the option to uh, either delete, opt out, and under CPRA they're going to be given the right to correct. Then you look at laws like CDPA, which was the Virginia law that again creates a class of sensitive personal information. But what's different and really disruptive in the Virginia law is that it requires opt in. So this is the first law in the United States that's on the books that will require people who carry that type of information, anybody who is keeping that information in house, will be required to get opt in from the consumer to be able to do so. Again, it's going to start looking like GDPR. This is a law that will go into effect in January 2023. My sense is that there will be some additional laws that will be generated in Virginia that will impact this and better define CDPA. So I would say stay tuned.
Yeah, and I'm sure our listeners are kind of racking their brain to try to answer this question, but how can a brand ensure privacy compliance given that there's been sort of this expanded definition of PII under new laws and what's
Yeah.
coming out? Are there any easy steps to take to stay on the right side of the law, or are there internal or external teams you suggest having in place to kind of help guide you? What can they do now?
Yeah, Monique, it's a great question because when what you're seeing is the thrust of these laws are not just around what data is collected. It's also about what data is retained and when retained for how long.
Right.
This whole conversation now is evolving around this idea of, well, if you're going to hang on to data for any period of time, you can't do it in perpetuity. And if you do, then there's going to be potential risks or liabilities for companies that they go down that path. So um, I think that when you ask what can brands do, uh, a lot of them are doing it, and that is you're seeing the greater presence of chief privacy officers or chief
Hmm.
compliance officers. So across the industry, people are becoming more cognizant of where these laws are and what they need to do in order to stay compliant. I would say there's no really easy cookie cutter thing you can do. It's not like there's an app you can buy and then that's it.
That
You,
would be nice if there was.
yeah, it would.
So then, along the same lines as that last question, how will the industry focus on privacy kind of effectively change the way that marketers can identify and engage consumers? There's the whole question of
Yeah.
does do you have to choose between personalization and privacy, and can you do both safely?
Yeah, again another great question. On the targeting front, you have companies like LiveRamp and Google, who are each kind of putting out into the marketplace two different approaches to consumer targeting going forward.
Hmm.
Um, Google is talking about uh, this idea of cohorts. Surfing behavior will be tracked, but not as an individual, but as a device or sort of an ID proxy for somebody, something. And the idea is that the different sites that you visit are a composite of who you are, and therefore you can be targeted based on the resolution of the variety of different websites that you visit. And through that, it develops a cohort. Um, Interestingly, not too dissimilar from what Claritas does from segmentation. Now I'll get to that in a second. The second approach is being put out there by LiveRamp and Trade Desk in this concept called ID 2.0, which is going to be a combination of uh, probably first party cookies and some other identifier, browser level identifier. And it's not as clear cut as what some of the other strategies in the past, like cookies, have been.
Hmm.
Um, but these two concepts are kind of fighting themselves out. These consumer privacy laws are going to make it kind of interesting for people who uh, are either buying targeting, buying segmentation, or carrying that type of information within their own CRM data, because there's going to be a need, particularly in Virginia, for this opt-in. What's interesting about that, and as you look at a company like Claritas, we're very different from these other organizations in the sense that we are selling a segmented data set that is based on a prism or a
Hmm.
amalgamation of what we believe an individual looks like. So in other words, we're not tying. There's no specific information that we have that says, for example, we know that your education level is X, or that your religion is Y, or that your marital status is Z. We're not looking at that. We're looking at where you live and what the averages are of people who look like you in your general neighborhood and in other neighborhoods that look very much like your neighborhood around the
Right.
country. And as a result, we don't have any particular or specific personal information attributed to a given individual. Likewise, when you look at our ethnicity products, um, there are companies out there who are applying age and ethnicity to your file as an append, essentially transferring from what they know to your that they keep on a national name and address file. They're appending ethnicity, race, acculturation, religion, what have you. They're appending that to a customer data set.
Right. And I do think that's been a little bit of a misconception about syndicated segmentation. A lot of people are confused thinking that it is, you know, individual data that gives you the segments and that sort of thing. But like you
Right.
said, it's modeled. So there's no individual PII in the segments that you would receive as a business to use for your targeting efforts.
Okay, Monique, we get to switch seats then because you're saying it better than I am.
Well, that's why I'm in marketing.
That's right.
You've got the technical background. I've got the
Right.
creative
There you go.
background.
Clearly, clearly. Thank you.
Well, Al, I think that's a lot for marketers to chew on, but it also kind of puts us at a great place to take a quick commercial break and come back with Ben. So thank you so much again for joining me today.
Thank you, Monique, and I look forward to having the same conversation in a year.
Excellent. So stick around, listeners, because when we come back, we'll be joined by Ben Isaacson of In House Privacy. Hey there, marketers. We've been talking privacy in this episode of the podcast, and one way to stay on the right side of those rules and regulations is by leveraging identity graph intelligence to find and reach your best customers. In case you missed it, we have a white paper that goes into detail on how to use your identity graph to identify your best customers, deliver customized campaigns, and optimize results, all while making privacy a priority. Access the white paper through the link in our show notes or via our website, claritas.com, under the resources section of our Insights tab. And now, back to the episode. We're back from our commercial break, and I'm so excited to be joined by Ben Isaacson, Principal of In House Privacy, whose mission is to provide companies with privacy professionals so they can stay up to date with the evolving privacy landscape. Ben, welcome to the Marketing Insider.
Thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you. So, I've got a pretty sizable list of questions for you today because the topic of privacy is so hot right now. But let me start first by having you give a little bit of background into who you are and your areas of expertise, since I just gave you a brief introduction.
Thanks. Yeah. Hi. My name is Ben Isaacson. This July is my 25th year working on internet privacy. I started out in 1996 as the first internet industry lobbyist working for the Association for Interactive Media, or actually it was the Interactive Television Association back then. Over the last 25 years, I've seen just a dramatic change in the industry, and gotten to a place now where my organization provides kind of privacy gap fillers for any company of any size, from high level strategic advice to privacy operations to backfilling, privacy counsel positions that are needing to be filled, or just helping companies build a privacy program.
Very cool. I didn't realize you've been around since the beginnings of the internet. Wow.
Yeah.
So, as you know, this month's podcast episode, it's centered around privacy, but why has this topic exploded over the past few years? We've kind of seen an increase in new regulations come out recently. So, was there some sort of catalyst that kicked everything off?
Yes. So what we've seen in the data collection space kind of mirrors what we're seeing in the data regulation space. So, uh, you know, 10 years ago, we saw 1 zettabyte of data collected per year online, and now we're seeing 35 zettabytes of data
Uh-huh.
collected per year. And so, for the past really 30 years of really commercialization of the internet, we saw the first 10 years was purely learning and grow, just trying to figure this thing out. The second 10 years was that explosive getting everyone online, getting business models established. And now with the last 10 years, it's pretty much maturity, and now, of course, regulations follow. So it's a natural progression, but the internet collection, issue is data collection is really exponential, and kind of lit up the regulators' mindsets around the issue.
Right. So you spoke a little bit about this when you gave us some background on you and in-house privacy, but I'm curious, what are companies coming to you for help with most these days, and how are you guiding them through the privacy landscape?
Well, I mean, the last 3 years have been, tremendously impactful with the GDPR, really as the initial onset of change that
Hmm.
required a global benchmark approach, and then the CCPA coming along. Even though it's a California law, I think most companies have seen this as a federal standard that they need to follow. And then this last year has just been unbelievable with the Apple iOS 14 changes, the Google cookie deprecation proposal,
Right.
and of course the new state laws that we're going to talk about in California, Virginia, and most recently Colorado. It has just been a hotbed of interest from all sizes of companies. Whether it's privacy by design for startups to large enterprises just trying to get their compliance under wraps.
Hmm.
Um, and it's been great to see CEOs, and as I think you've talked to your CTO Al Gadbut, who deeply cares about privacy. To get the C-level interest in privacy has been a long time coming, and wonderful to, in my opinion, to see.
Right. So this might be one of those questions that doesn't really have a definitive answer, but what do you think the end goal is with privacy regulations? Is there more to it than just protecting consumers' online identities?
Yes, and that's a great question, and it really depends on your perspective. So I lived in Europe for a time right after GDPR came into effect, and for Europeans, it's a fundamental right. It's not a compliance checkbox,
Hmm.
and it really focuses on privacy by design and understanding the mindset of the end user, the data subject, as they're called in Europe. Um, for Americans, it's much more about just don't be evil, and it's incredibly subjective. And most companies try and reverse engineer that "don't be evil" from the bad actions into creating good policies,
Hmm.
which takes a bit longer to get right. And so we tend to rely, often on industry self-regulation, such as what we've seen with ad tech and the NAI and DAA, self-regulatory efforts, and just the myriad of laws that have been proposed both in the states and the federal Congress that just take too much time to really get to a final resolution.
I did read that since January of this year, more than 26, I believe it is, states have introduced some sort of privacy bill, and a lot of them have already died in committees, but several of them are still active. So aside from some of the newer ones that have passed, like you mentioned, the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act or CDPA, what do you foresee as the next wave of regulations that marketers will have to navigate?
So, this is a really tricky issue because, we keep seeing states kind of one up each other on
Hmm.
privacy. And in fact, California has one upped itself on privacy with the CPRA being adopted last year, and it comes into a force in January. And so I think Al mentioned in his comments about the Virginia opt-in requirement for
Right.
sensitive data. That sensitive also includes things like ethnicity and precise geolocation. And this is really the next wave that I think we're going to see is this notion that consent should be required for certain types of data collection. And that could include ad tech, which has been in the crosshairs of a number of different states' proposals. And this kind of a notion that consent is a silver bullet is misguided, I believe.
Hmm.
Just as Apple's approach to consent for IDFA is somewhat misguided in the approach they've taken, and it doesn't consider the kind of the privacy architecture that companies are considering in context for when consent is meaningful and when consent is just plain annoying. um,
Right.
and so, all these kind of pop-ups, that you go to with cookie banners and now with IDFA consent on every app, consumers are getting annoyed about it in droves, and which is leading to this consent friction. So
Hmm.
this wave of what we're seeing is, I think, is the pinnacle of consent right now may end up, either leading to an outright ban, unfortunately, because they don't know how to get regulators don't know how to get around consent as a necessity, or we start to look at more meaningful and thoughtful regulations that use consent as a tool and not salvation. And there are other ways to rely on marketers, best practices and context as a way of getting awareness and use instead of consent. But that's a long way to go.
Right. We know that tech companies, and you mentioned this, are now lobbying for federal laws around privacy, but they seem to be lobbying for ones that are a little bit less stringent than some of the state laws, like the ones we've seen come out of California. So, if and when a federal law or federal laws are passed, what will marketers on an individual basis need to follow, especially if they're operating on a national scale? Will federal trump state law, or is there some sort of hybrid approach to remain compliant?
Yeah, so I was instrumental in lobbying for the passage of the Can Spam Act for email
Hmm.
marketing in 2003, and for 5 years even prior to that was bringing email marketers up to Congress to meet with legislators and help educate around the necessity for a baseline email law that preempted the state laws that were popping up all over the country, including an opt-in law that came in California. And so we're looking at the exact same scenario here, where all these, again, pop-up laws, including some opt-in provisions around the states. But the problem is we're in a much different world than we were in 2002.
Right.
In the political landscape that just unfortunately they can't agree on anything right now. Um, so preemption is going to be a much harder, hill to climb on, I guess, pun intended, on Capitol Hill, um, than what we saw, more than a decade ago, or
Hmm.
2 decades ago. So, we're going to need a much bigger lobbying effort that we barely scratched the surface so far. So Facebook, certainly putting some dollars behind it is great. But in order to get a true federal law that preempts all these states, we're going to need, 10 times more money than poured into Congress than what we've seen so far. And just again, the lobbying, for anybody listening to this to meet with their local congressperson, go to Washington if they have to, and sit down and explain how these myriad of state laws are really too burdensome to comply with by themselves. Otherwise, we might get a federal law that doesn't actually preempt and doesn't change the patchwork that we're now seeing and makes it too complex for companies to possibly comply with.
Right. That's great advice. Get involved if you can. So Ben, I think it's been a pretty eye-opening conversation so far, and we've had a lot of great information come out of you and sharing your expertise. So we definitely appreciate it. But I do have one final question for you before I let you get back to keeping companies on the right side of privacy laws. So, will we see more companies like Google and Apple making updates to the power that they're giving consumers over their data? And what will that mean for partners of those companies that use their platforms for consumer targeting purposes?
Yeah, this is the question of the times today.
Mhm.
And what Apple has pulled off with their iOS 14 changes is truly the first global internet regulation.
Mm.
They have taken it on themselves to try and enforce these policies around the world, and have so far been successful even in deterring the Chinese, for example, from operating workarounds to these policies, and which is absolutely unbelievable. Um, the flip side of that is Google trying to deprecate the Chrome cookies, and now what we saw from the UK and the Competition and Market Authority really giving Google pause in doing so showcases that there is still some friction around companies trying to operate independently of the law.
Hmm.
Um, and so, we're seeing this kind of tight balancing act, but ultimately there's this notion that Apple's putting forth, and again, they're putting ad dollars behind it too with their TV ads that I'm seeing in the NBA finals right now, uh, that first party data is good and third party data is bad. That's a new privacy philosophy that truly is novel and really subjective to Apple.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think Google's kind of trying to follow suit, perhaps for their own competitive advantage as well. And a lot of companies are going to follow suit. So these walled gardens, or as Eric Seufert, calls them, content fortresses, are going to be much more prevalent. And it's going to take a much more cohesive ad industry or marketing industry to come together to try and build our own open web fortress, I guess,
Hmm.
to compete against these major platforms. But it's only the beginning, I think, of the operating system and browser wars with the open web as we know it.
Right. Well, Ben, thanks again for joining me on the Marketing Insider.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
Well, we appreciate you sharing just a small fraction of your knowledge with us to help make privacy a little more clear. And we'll definitely have future episodes on this topic and more content on our website available around privacy. And hopefully, we can tap into you to share even more of your knowledge when we release those things.
That'd be great. Thanks, Monique.
Well, folks, that's it for today's episode. In addition to Ben, I want to thank Claritas' own CTO, Al Gadbut, for joining me on this important topic. But I also want to thank those of you listening at home or on the go. We'll be continuing the topic of privacy on our website, so if you're interested in learning even more, head over to claritas.com. And if you've not already, please take a moment to follow, like, and subscribe to the Marketing Insider so you never miss an episode. Rate us 5 stars on your podcast app of choice, our favorite being Spotify, and share us with a friend or colleague so we can keep the conversation going. And with that, we'll see you next time with a brand new episode. Bye now.